Well, like a lot of these things, the wheels of justice have not turned very speedily. So there have been delays for 3 years in this process. The initial inquest was held, but now over the next few weeks, we're going to get the inquiry. And that's really going to give us a sense of, where the investigation is. There'll be statements from Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia. We'll really get a much better idea about the poisoning and the things that happened here in 2018. And it's starting today with statements about Dawn Sturgess, the woman who died after mistakenly rubbing the Novichok poison on her wrist, thinking it was a perfume.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this has been a very unusual case because we've sort of learnt quite a lot about it as it's gone on, because there have been a lot of investigations sort of carried out into it by sort of various open source actors. Is it quite unusual for anything that involving the security services, or indeed a sort of attempted assassination by foreign security services, to be sort of fleshed out in public in quite this way?
Yes, I think it is unusual. I mean, we're going to get that towards the end of this month. There's going to be another hearing in London, and some members of the intelligence services will give evidence. There'll also be written statements, including from Sergei Skripal and his daughter. They will not be giving evidence, but it provides the best chance for a couple of years, really, for us to get an insight into the state of the investigation. And this question about Russian state responsibility for what happened in Salisbury is very much at the centre of the inquiry's terms of reference.
Do you expect that this inquiry will, how to put this, reveal anything that was not previously known, or will it just reveal stuff that was not previously known to us?
Well, certainly the latter.
I don't just mean you and me. I mean, the public generally.
The Met Police, for example, have been extremely careful and laid out things in a very limited way. They always said this was because they had the ambition to bring the people they've accused of the crime, the two Russian military intelligence officers who travelled there in 2018, to trial, somehow to try and get hold of them by extradition or some other process. And they didn't want to prejudice any trial. But, I think as the hopes of getting any sort of trial get less and less, I think there will be some more candour. We will find out more.
Yeah, okay. And presumably the inquiry will also be looking at the public health response, what took place in Salisbury, whether that could have been done better, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely will. And in a way, I mean, the really key thing, and I'm not sure whether we'll get the definitive evidence on this, is what happened to that fake perfume, the bottle, the Nina Ricci bottle with the Novichok in it. Can the police tie that to those two suspects during the weeks that passed between the attempt on Sergei Skripal's life and then Dawn Sturgess tragically using it, thinking it was perfume, and dying as a result?
Well, you mean whether it was just sitting in a hedge or whether it sort of floated around a bit?
Exactly. How that bottle can be connected or not to the two individuals already subject to arrest warrants, those two Russian intelligence officers. They've never really said that, the police.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Theresa May, who was Prime Minister when the attack occurred, she said that she doesn't think the family of Dawn Sturgess will ever get justice. That, as you said, that it's unlikely that the Russian agents involved will ever be extradited, particularly at the moment. Do you think Russia will even notice this inquiry going on? Will it be reported on there, do you imagine?
I suspect there'll be some caustic commentary and sort of trolling from certain Russian media actors about this. But, let's see.
Yeah, indeed. Well, because there has been a sort of very weird tone on this from Russia, sort of almost like a sort of smirking tone on social media, almost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very, very strange. Look, let's go to the Middle East now, because this morning 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed and dozens more injured after a Hezbollah strike on an army base in response to Israeli attacks on the Lebanese capital in Beirut. And Israel, meanwhile, has been accused of breaching international law by the UN for entering a UN peacekeeper position with tanks, which the UN says put its peacekeepers in danger. Mark, just to help us understand this, UN peacekeepers have been in South Lebanon for nearly 50 years. They don't necessarily seem to have been doing a super job of keeping the peace. What are they there for?
Well, they went in after an Israeli invasion in 1978, which had precisely the same objective as has been stated by the Israeli military now, which was to clear the part of Lebanon south of the Litani River, which runs about 20 kilometers north of the common border with Israel, of armed factions. Now, back then it was Palestinians. Now it's Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite faction. But, that's why they went in. And then they were reinforced after the 2006 battle between Israel and Hezbollah. And the idea was that under the resolution passed at the time, 1701, they would control the south of Lebanon, that very southernmost bit, along with the Lebanese army, and stop Hezbollah going back in there. And that's the respect in which, your question is right. They did not succeed in that. And so consequently, the Israelis are of the argument that, they should go and sort things out in their terms. But clearly, the idea of deliberately attacking UN peacekeepers runs counter to all kinds of international legal statutes.
Yeah, I mean, does it represent something of a crisis for because people often would say that the answer to almost any conflict is that you send in UN peacekeepers. But the fact that, as you say, I mean, the assault by Hezbollah has happened pretty much under the nose of UN peacekeepers. What does the UN say about that?
Well, there are limits to what they can do, aren't there? I mean, there was some press were taken yesterday and shown what was said by the IDF to be a tunnel used by Hezbollah, 100 or 200 meters from a UN forces base. And they showed them this, I guess, to try and show the impotence of the UN. But it is tricky. And the more critical element of this has been the limited power of the Lebanese army. It was conceived as a sort of joint operation, the UN force post 2006. And it's clearly not worked. The matter is going to be subject of a UN Security Council debate this evening. And it's sure to figure later in the week at the European summit as well, because in order to stop this, the fighting that's going on in Lebanon, there's going to have to be some reversioning of a similar understanding to the 2006 one. And then the big question will be, well, what will the role of the Lebanese army and indeed those UN forces that are currently, being in some way hassled by the Israelis, what will their role be in this new arrangement? Because without a new arrangement, it won't be possible to get a ceasefire and to get the Israeli army to withdraw south of that border.
Yeah, indeed. Look, well, Benjamin Netanyahu, he's urged the UN to remove peacekeepers from Lebanon, saying that they're becoming human shields and hostages of Hezbollah and so on. As you were saying before, journalists have been shown areas where Hezbollah is operating very close to them. Do you think, is there any chance that the UN does that? I mean, presumably that would be an incredibly big deal if the UN actually pulled out of Lebanon.
Yeah, look, I think some of the outposts have been abandoned by the UN in their own safety. I think the Israelis asked at the outset of this military action, they asked them to leave for their own safety, and some have withdrawn. I think what's interesting here is that some of the governments who feel more strongly about this, like the Irish government, have clearly instructed their troops to stay put. So in that sense, it's a battle of wills.
Wow. The row between Israel and the UN is sort of gone on. I mean, it's gone on forever, but it's worsened throughout the year. Where do you think it goes next? Is there any way that sort of relations can be repaired there?
Well, that is a fascinating issue, because undoubtedly a sort of repurposing and perhaps beefing up of this UN force in southern Lebanon is arguably the best way to enforce the 2006 resolution and indeed any future UN resolution that comes in to try and stop the current wave of fighting. So in a way, the Israelis, as in 1978, as in 2000 when they left Lebanon, as in 2006 when they had a previous round of fighting there, are going to be relying on the UN, however much they don't like dealing with them, unless they find a way to put in a different kind of multinational force in the south of Lebanon under different sort of leadership. But the idea of countries volunteering to send troops to that is, I think, at the moment far-fetched.
Well, I mean, there's obviously a dichotomy there, whereas Israel wants UN troops to be in Lebanon in order to basically keep the peace against Hezbollah, whereas many other nations, I suppose, including Ireland, probably want the UN peacekeepers to be there to defend the Lebanese from the Israelis. So it's quite hard.
Absolutely.
It's quite hard to see how they can do how they can do both at once. Look, Mark, you mentioned that there is a UN Security Council today and the European Summit at the end of the week. David Lammy is going to be meeting with EU ministers to discuss the UK's cooperation in the Middle East and elsewhere, of course, including Ukraine. What other stuff will they be talking about?
Well, Ukraine is the key thing. I mean, I think one other thing to mention here, under our old unofficial rule that I wind in something extra at the end, is David Lammy's, I think, due in China, I beg your pardon, not Taiwan, today. And of course, China has just ramped up its military presence very close to Taiwan in terms of air and naval activity. It is clearly once again, as it does periodically, putting military pressure on Taiwan, just as David Lammy arrives in China. So that's a tricky thing for him to negotiate this week. It'll be interesting to see what messages he gives publicly about that pressure on Taiwan.
Wow, yeah, that's one to watch for sure. His engagement, Lammy's engagement with EU ministers. He's meeting 27 EU ministers, I understand, and EU heads of state are also going to be lobbying the Gulf countries over the Middle East as well. Are we dealing now as a country with the EU in a slightly different way than we were under perhaps a past regime?
Well. The phrase you hear again and again is that the mood music has changed since the Starmer government came in. I think in reality, what that means is there's a warmer relationship, less confrontational, and perhaps, particularly on the bilateral channels with France and Germany, for example, and Italy, a little bit more candid and a little bit less of a sense that the UK is trying in some way still to leverage Brexit and to try and still, in some ways, to use the great phrase, take a cakeist approach. Now that there's a new government with Keir Starmer having committed to rebuild the relationship and indeed to try and make the whole deal work more smoothly, there is a change of atmosphere. But, it is still very much the case that the UK is not a member, will not be in the formal sessions in the same way, obviously has no vote anymore, and is in that sense on the sidelines on Thursday and Friday.
Yeah, and look, finally, Mark, the EU leaders this week meeting with leaders from the Gulf, as I said, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Is that the first summit of this nature between the EU and the Middle East? Has this happened in the past?
Well, there have been engagements of this kind. I don't think it's exactly groundbreaking. I think it's particularly important, though, at this time, because clearly, if you look at Saudi Arabia and UAE, they are the principal Gulf states that are aligned, if you like, with Western intentions, particularly vis-a-vis Iran and about the urgency of trying to bring to an end the conflict between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. That is Mark there, still on his staircase in Salisbury. So I hope you managed to find a chair or at least a wall to lean against, Mark. I'm very interested to hear your reporting back from there on what is going on at the Salisbury inquiry today.